Welcome to my new YouTube series, Witchy Ways, where we explore the paths of modern witchcraft, and I share with you some of my insights, some of my stories, and some of my experiences within the tradition. We're filming inside today, once again because it is really super windy outside, and I wasn't even able to film in my conservatory because the wind is howling so bad that you probably wouldn't be able to hear me on the microphone. So we are here inside in my meditation stroke altar room inside my house. So welcome. Hi Barnabas. You want to see Barnabas? He's so handsome. Oh, yeah, he's my big boy. And I am never separate from my big boy. Nope. Never, ever, ever. Today I'd like to talk to you a bit about what is modern witchcraft. So modern witchcraft is an earth-based tradition, and what that means is that we are attuning ourselves to the seasons, to the cycles of nature, in order to find how we can live holistically with the world. It is a very green tradition, in the sense that we're very conscious of our impact on the ecosystem, and so we're trying to do the least amount of harm as we progress in our lives. We're working with the forces of nature in order to better ourselves and to better our understanding of the world. As well, we're working with the forces of nature through magic, through spellcraft, in order to better our lives and the lives of others around us. Witchcraft is often seen as a dualistic form of spirituality, where deity is split into two, and in witchcraft it is often a god and a goddess. So we have the life force, the all, one, which is often split into a goddess and god, and then the union of the goddess and god form the whole, come back into the one in this ever evolving cycle of nature and of life. When I say we see deity as a goddess and a god, we don't have to think of it in very specific gender terms even. We can see the all, the life force, nature itself, and then we can see that as we are all a part of this life force, a part of this nature, as soon as we are born, we develop some sense of individuation from the life force. So we can find that we have some sort of separateness while still being connected to the whole, if that makes any sense. And through the journey of our life, we are trying to deal with that individuation of ourselves until our death, when we come to meet with the all once again and simply join up with the entirety of the life force of the all as we move into spirit essence. I talk about modern witchcraft because we're not entirely sure what witches did, what witches believed, even a few hundred years ago. Like Druidry, witchcraft was an oral tradition, and so we don't have written documents, we don't have a written history that we can follow that tells us what exactly witches did. Often witchcraft is called the old religion, and this can be related to Charles Leland's book, Aradia, or the Gospel of Witches, in which he called it la vecchia religione, which is the old religion. This appeals to many, not only because it's quite a romanticized term, but it also acknowledges the fact that witchcraft has been around for an awfully long time, and that it is based on a pre-Christian tradition. We're not necessarily saying that the witchcraft we follow today is a pre-Christian tradition, because traditions change, traditions evolve, and we're not entirely sure what our ancestors did, nor would we entirely be sure that that would even be appropriate for today's day and age. And so we say it's the old religion, or we can call it the old ways, but really what this means is that it is based on the old ways, that it is based on the old religion, and that it is not itself entirely the old religion. Witchcraft acknowledges that there are many deities, so you might have a dualistic approach to deity where you see it as a goddess and a god, or you might be polytheistic and you might believe that there are many gods and many goddesses, and you might incorporate veneration of these gods within a certain pantheon in your tradition. You can also be agnostic in witchcraft and not know exactly what it's all about, what deity is, but you can still honor nature in and of itself. There are many different types of witchcraft. So there is Wicca, which I mentioned in the earlier video, which is a very modern form of witchcraft, which was developed in the early 1950s. There are many different traditions within modern witchcraft as well, which have evolved from around that time and also from before that time. So, for example, we have British traditional witchcraft, which is the witchcraft that is based before Gerald Gardner came into the public eye with his Wicca. So those witches who follow British traditional witchcraft would not call themselves Wiccans, they would call themselves witches. Whereas people who follow Gerald Gardner's tradition often call themselves Wiccans as opposed to witches. Often the two terms are interchanged as well, so many Wiccans would call themselves witches, although not every witch would call themselves a Wiccan, if that makes any sense. There's a hedge witch, which is often a solitary path, but a hedge witch is also somebody who learns to straddle the boundary between the worlds, and often this is seen as riding the hedge. The hedge is often a boundary, a liminal place, and hedge witches work with liminal places in order to gain information so that they can take that back into their own lives, to change their lives, to gain inspiration as to how to work with nature, and basically to benefit themselves and the world around them as much as they can. The opposite of a hedge witch might be somebody who is part of a coven. A coven is a group of witches who get together to celebrate the seasons, to do magical spells, basically even to just hang out, to do social activities as well. It's kind of a chosen family that is based upon Wicca or witchcraft, depending on what tradition you are following. Covens can be anything from 3 people to however many people you want, although traditionally it's said that covens are usually 13 in number because that's the largest amount of people that you can easily fit within a 9-foot circle, which is the area that you perform your spells, your rituals in. Again, this is all dependent upon your witchcraft tradition. Some traditions don't have any of these so-called rules or so-called boundaries or guidelines. It's much freer, much more freeform, such as hedge witchcraft. You can have green witches, green witchcraft, which is a very ecological-based witchcraft. There is Gardnerian witchcraft, which is based on the works of Gerald Gardner, which I've already talked about previously. There's also Alexandrian witchcraft, which is based on the work of Alex Saunders, who basically took Gerald Gardner's work and just slightly adapted it for his own way of doing things. And what Alex Saunders brought into witchcraft and into Wicca was learning. So he taught within his coven, within his group, as opposed to simply just practicing doing your witchcraft, he actually brought teaching into the tradition, into his tradition, which has kind of carried on through to this day. There is solitary Wicca, which is quite similar to hedge witchcraft in the fact that you are often working alone. But solitary witchcraft can blend with many other different witchcrafts, such as eclectic witchcraft. Eclectic witchcraft is a tradition that borrows from many other traditions and taking elements of other traditions into your own path and then forming your own path based upon what you feel has worked for you, what benefits you and what benefits everyone around you. That being said, there are many, many other different forms of witchcraft. I've just briefly touched upon a few that are probably the most popular forms of witchcraft today. As I said previously, witchcraft follows the seasons and the cycles of nature, and we do so following a format called the Wheel of the Year. And the Wheel of the Year was developed by Gerald Gardner and Ross Nichols. And these two friends got together and, based upon looking at history and folklore, they developed a system that followed basically a festival every 6 weeks in order to honor the seasons, the cycles, and the tides of nature. So they would look to the agricultural year and find out when the plowing began. They would see when the harvest began, when the fields were lying dormant, and then they researched local traditions in order to come up with this Wheel of the Year. And the Wheel of the Year is a beautiful modern interpretation of what we see happening all around us in nature from our own human-centric point of view. The Wheel of the Year is divided into 8 festivals. These festivals in witchcraft are called Sabbats. It starts at Yule, which is otherwise known as the winter solstice, and this is the time of darkness. It is the longest night of the year. It's the time when the sun is at its lowest. Then we have Imbolc, which is on the 30th of January to the 1st of February. And this celebrated the lambing season, because here in Britain the lambing comes into season much earlier than, say, in North America. And it even depends on what part of Britain you're in, because if you're in Scotland, the lambing season would be much later as well, because it's that much further north, and it would take longer for the lambs to actually come into season. We have the spring equinox, otherwise known as Ostara in the witchcraft tradition. That's my cat sneezing. She has a cold. Ostara celebrates the spring equinox, the vernal equinox, the time of equal day and equal night, from the Latin equi, meaning equal, and nox, meaning night. Then we move into Beltane, which is a Celtic word, and it's a Celtic festival. It celebrated the beginning of summer, and that was on the 30th of April to the 1st of May. Beltane was a time when cattle were moved from their indoor pastures, not indoor pastures, but from their winter pastures to their summer pastures, and often they were walked between 2 big bonfires so that the smoke would clean the animals of all the fleas and ticks and anything else that had harbored on them over the winter months. And it's a festival of celebration, it's a festival of moving into summer, it's a festival of fire and a festival of light, and a festival as well within witchcraft of the union of goddess and god, when they come together and the whole world then suddenly bursts into bloom, into flowers, into greenery, and we see the hawthorn trees coming out in their beautiful blossoms, and everything just seems alive, all nature seems to come alive. Then we have the summer solstice, otherwise known as Litha, and this is opposite to Yule, the winter solstice, where at Litha we have the time of the longest light. So the sun has reached its zenith in the sky. It's the time of the longest day and the shortest night. Solstice means to stand still, and the sun will rise and set on the same point in the horizon for 3 days, and it seems to stand still, and then it will start rising and setting a little bit closer to each other until it reaches its lowest point at the winter solstice. So we're celebrating that pause just before the sun and the days start to get shorter and the sun's strength starts to weaken as we head towards the winter months. We celebrate the god because the god in Wicca and witchcraft is seen as a solar deity. So we are celebrating the god at his height, at his peak, just before the fall. Then we have Lammas, sometimes known as Lunasa. Lunasa is a Celtic term. Lammas is an Anglo-Saxon term. Lammas means loaf mass, which celebrates the first cutting of the wheat, because here in Britain the wheat is cut towards the end of July, beginning of August, depending on how the weather has been. This is often seen as the god beginning to lose his power, a vegetation god, as he's beginning to lose his power because the fields are starting to be harvested and he's starting to prepare for his descent into the underworld. Then we have Mabon, which is the autumn equinox, again the time of equal day and equal night. And again, this can be seen as the second harvest, and often this is the harvest of apples, harvest of many berries, lots of berries in the hedgerows at this time of year. And again, it's also a celebration of the preparation of the vegetation god, of the solar deity, who will lose his strength and his power as we head into the winter months, which ends the cycle of the year at Samhain. Samhain again is a Celtic term. It means summer's end. Samhain is also known as Halloween, and at Halloween the god has passed through the veil of this world into the other world. So we can see Samhain as the time of the death of the solar god, the beginning of winter, and waiting for the rebirth of the god at Yule, the winter solstice, when the days suddenly start to get longer again and the solar deity starts to gain in power. So the wheel of the year in witchcraft follows the life cycle of the god, of the male force, of the male deity within witchcraft. Then we have what is known as Esbats, and Esbats are celebrating anything that isn't a Sabbath, but mostly what Esbats are celebrating are the cycles of the moon. Now the goddess is seen as represented by the moon, whereas the god is represented by the sun, the goddess is often represented by her symbol, the moon. Esbats are often celebrated every full moon, although some traditions also hold an Esbat at the dark of the moon. They might hold an Esbat at the new moon, when the first sliver of crescent is seen in the sky just before sunset. These are a time of getting together to do magic. It's a time also of celebration, and also to honor the seasons and the cycles and the tides of our own selves and our own emotions as we're moving through the grander wheel of the year. So it's a time to connect at different points in each season's cycle. Esbats often honor the feminine aspect, whereas the Sabbats honor the male aspect of deity. However, in most traditions, the goddess and the god are honored simultaneously at each of these festivals, Sabbats, Esbats, whatever you want to call them. Witchcraft is a tradition that practices magic, as I stated earlier, and magic is seen as working with the forces of nature in order to create a change. Now this change is something that you must really feel a deep need for within witchcraft. We don't cast spells willy-nilly without reason. There usually must always be a reason in order to do spellcraft, and often this is when physical means of achieving your desired end haven't come into fruition. So if we say we want a better job, we won't instantly do a spell and hope that we get a better job. We're going to have to work at it in the physical realm, as in looking for jobs, applying for jobs, going to interviews, and we can add spellcraft onto the top of that to boost our intention, to boost our work in the world, just to give it a little bit of an extra edge. And to do so, we're working with the forces of nature. So we might work with the forces of the tides. I live very close to the ocean, so we might work with the flow of the tide when the tide is rising. We might work with the ebb of the tide when the tide is going out. We might work at high tide. We might work with the powers of the sun. We might work with the powers of the moon. We might work astrologically, so when a planet or the sun or the moon is in a certain sign, we might work on certain days which have astrological associations to magic. Essentially, magic is just something that we would incorporate in order to take better control of our lives, because we know within witchcraft that each and every person is utterly responsible for their own lives. We cannot lay that responsibility on anybody else, just like we cannot lay the blame of anything we do onto anybody else. We have to take full responsibility for our lives. And so to do so, we also incorporate spellcraft into our tradition, because it gives us a greater sense of achievement. It gives us a greater sense of being able to work in the world to create a positive change in our own lives. Within Wicca, you wouldn't do any negative magic, because that would go against the Wiccan Rede, which ends with the very famous and often quoted lines, "And it harm none, do what ye will." In witchcraft, it's more of a grey area, so you have to decide if what you are doing is a good or a bad thing. You don't have the Wiccan Rede telling you not to do bad things. It's up to you to decide for you and for this circumstance what is good and what is bad. Witchcraft uses certain basic tools, and we'll be going over those tools in a separate video where I'll show you the tools that I have, what they're used for, and how they are used in the tradition generally. Some forms of witchcraft are seen as an initiatory tradition, and this is where one person, a group, a coven, would initiate others into their tradition. If you are practicing as a solitary witch, then you would not have this form of initiation bestowed upon you. And this form of initiation is absolutely not necessary. When we look at the word initiation, it simply means to start. So we can start on our path at any time that we want. If we look at the other interpretation of initiation, which means you are gaining access to mysteries or to perhaps power of a certain tradition, again, you can do this perfectly well on your own. When you start to understand the mysteries, when you start to understand the cycles of life, when you start to build a connection to the goddess and God. Initiation can only be bestowed upon you by nature itself, in essence, because, as Scott Cunningham often says, who initiated the first witch? Obviously it wasn't another witch, because otherwise then they wouldn't be the first. But some traditions would prefer to have initiation from person to person, from a coven to an individual in order to pass on their teachings and their traditions, and that's perfectly acceptable for that tradition. However, for most solitaries like myself, initiation can happen at any point in your work. You can do a self-initiation if you would prefer to start your path and say, have a designated starting point and say, on this date I started on my path as a witch. You can also do a self-dedication if you prefer, and if that makes more sense to you, where you are dedicating yourself to this path, to the goddess and God. What I did was I started with a self-dedication, and after a few years, after I had learned and after I taught myself, spoken to others, learned a lot more about the path and the tradition, when I felt I was then able to call myself a witch, I performed a self-initiation ritual in which the goddess and the god were welcomed into the circle and initiated me as a witch. Now, to be honest, I've always been a witch in my life. I've always had very kind of witchy powers of premonition, dreams, connection to animals, to know what people are thinking, and these powers, you know, just didn't have a definition, they didn't have a name. However, once I found witchcraft, I was able to give it a name and to define it within a certain tradition. And so, being able to initiate yourself into a certain tradition, whether it's solitary, whether it's Gardnerian, Alexandrian, green witchcraft, eclectic witchcraft, whatever, being able to initiate yourself into a tradition can give you that starting point, that date where you definitely said, yes, I am such and such. And for some people this is hugely important because it means that they can go back to that date in journals or in their mind, in their memories, and remember everything that happened. For some people, it's not important at all. They feel that life itself is a constant initiation into the mysteries of nature, into the mysteries of the goddess and God. So again, this is purely a personal thing for you, whether you seek initiation from nature, from the goddess and God, or whether you seek initiation from a coven if you choose to work with other people. This is just a very brief overview of what witchcraft is today. And next videos we will look at, as I said earlier, tools of witchcraft. We will also look at building an altar, what we do in ritual, what we do in the Sabbats, what we do at the Esbats, at full moon rituals, and a whole host of other things. And I will share with you my own practices as well. So the tools I use, have a look at my altar, how I cast a circle, all these other aspects of the witchcraft tradition. And I sincerely hope that you will join me for the rest of this series. And thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you!